Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on November 10th, 2016, and you're listening to Episode 7, or at least the first half. We recorded this episode, and it got quite long because we started discussion about the US election, and we decided that it would be better to break off the sort of other segments that talk more specifically about Canadian news, and specifically BC news, and we're going to put that as a separate episode within a day, as soon as I get it edited after we post this. So look forward to that. A bonus episode even this week for your long weekend. Politicoast is the podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and around the country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast, and make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. Before we get in, we're going to talk about the US election, and we don't have an explicit tag on iTunes, but I'm going to swear in this episode, and you'll probably swear in this episode. So this is your warning that if that offends you, or if you're listening at work, or in front of children for some reason, it's going to happen. So just deal with it.
Before we get into that, got a little feedback and a correction. In last episode, I said the Conservatives left basically a balanced budget at $1 billion. It was actually $5 billion on the trend line and projected to go to a balanced budget next year.
But there's a certain amount of skepticism about the Conservative budgets because this is the same Conservative government that in 2008, when the markets were starting to crash, released a fiscal update that said everything's rosy and peachy. So yeah, it was more on me for being the lefty for not calling you out on it, and I was just more sort of, letting the conversation keep going.
And that $1 billion figure came from one of their earlier projections before some of the final numbers came in on their low resource revenue and everything else, and that was the number that just stuck in my head, and should have double-checked that at the time.
Fair enough. All right. Well, let's just dive right into it. On Tuesday, white Americans elected a fascist. And I'm not going to name him because he shall not be named. You can. People know who I'm talking about. And I'm also going to do everything I can to not normalize him, because this is someone Thomas Mulcair, the leader of the NDP, 6 months ago said is a fascist. He was calling out Justin Trudeau and saying, you should call him a fascist too. Of course, Trudeau didn't. Trudeau on election night released a milk toast.
I believe it's the same form letter they've released every 4 years.
We look forward to working together where we have to.
Yeah, that's the letter that was put out when Bush got elected, when Obama got elected. It's a formality.
Fair enough. It was a shocking victory. I sat just upstairs here with you and watched it, and we just sort of couldn't believe it happening as it happened. And ever since then, I've seen sort of the range of reactions on the Liberal side, at least, where it's from horror to shock to maybe we can be hopeful that we can still work together as in progressives to make a better world, to just fury. Like, fuck everything. I'm going to flip the table because people are angry and people in America are in the streets protesting, which is absolutely their right. And I potentially would be too, because it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, especially this time where Trump actually lost the popular vote. Trump came in a couple 100,000 votes short of Clinton, still won because of the fucking Electoral College that screws up everything, overrepresents some states, underrepresents others.
It's basically this long-term trend of trying to privilege middle America, which maybe initially in the States, when the only people who could vote were rich old white dudes, they went, we shouldn't concentrate all the power here in the cities. We should make sure the average person out in the rural place, who is also white, can vote and have their vote and voice recognized.
Well, it wasn't even just that. It was part of it was the communication at the time was not very good. People actually had to travel to correlate the votes. And the formula for it is each state gets a number of electoral votes equal to the senators plus congressmen. The tiny state like Wyoming with one congressman and 2 senators, because they all have 2 senators, they're massively overrepresented. And at least this really weird thing where if you perfectly game it, you can win the presidency with 22% of the vote by winning all the small states.
It makes first past the post here, and the way we do it, almost look reasonable, but it's also a nice irony that the douchebag who basically said he wouldn't concede because the system was rigged won because of a rigged system. What gets me is you look at the demographics and really was white people He won every breakdown of that. He won white women. He won white educated people. He won white rich people. He just won rich people. Poor people actually voted more for Clinton, but that might have been the race thing. I was looking at some of the exit polling, which America actually does. Canada does like fake exit polling where we ask like 100 people what they thought and then try to generalize. America does big exit polls like Britain, and I wish we had that so we had some data. But the thing that jumped out most is people who thought Obama did a bad job were the Trump voters. The people who thought he did a good job were the Clinton voters. And that's not that surprising, but it was the starkest.
Yeah, but that's also odd because Obama said a 55% approval rating. So this 47-48 split that was going on, just that doesn't map onto that. And that's just odd.
So I wonder if it's almost just the polling bias. So you can ask someone, do you approve of the job President Obama is doing? If it's just that question by itself, people might be like, yeah, you know what, it's fine. But if they just come out of a voting booth where they're like, fuck yeah, Trump, then they'll be like, yeah, Obama's terrible.
They're primed.
Yeah, they're primed. And the other thing that popped out at me at the demographics was the rural-urban divide. Rural white people, where it's almost predominantly white, is just massively the Trump country. It's massively the Republican country. And the cities are now the Democratic strongholds, even in the red
that's been an ongoing
states.
trend for a while.
And it's just gotten to this exacerbated line. And there's talk of needing to sort of break through that. And I don't know how you do that. Maybe you have the populists like Bernie Sanders try to present sort of progressive populist platform that appeals to those people. Maybe
demographics take care of it in 20 years, but that's still an awkward 20 years between now and then when, as America continues to urbanize.
Well, yeah, that's a lot of, let's be frank, dead black men in the street by cops. That's a lot of women who don't get to have abortions. That's a lot of new restrictions on abortion rights. That's a lot of anti-gay laws. That's a lot of anti-trans laws. That's a scary time. And there won't be a war with Russia. We know that. Or we're pretty sure of that, at least. But
well, there likely won't be one, but we're talking about someone who is completely unpredictable here. You know, one minor slide, and who knows what the fuck will happen there.
Who has also got a really big hard-on for conspiracies and really hates China. And China's also a big country with a strong army. And
nuclear weapons.
Yeah. I don't want any of this to happen. So I'm understandably still angry and upset.
And that's the thing that really confuses me. Like, okay, let's put aside all the policy agreements and just for the sake of argument, assume it's an even split on policies, or even Trump's policies, or maybe even slightly better, or something people can reasonably disagree on. But how do you look at Donald Trump and say this man should have nuclear weapons?
Because it's a bunch of people who are upset a black man was in charge of the country, and they wanted to flip the table because they don't feel represented anymore, because they've always been represented, and now they have a little bit less privilege. Or they still have the same amount of privilege, but they have a little bit less power, because someone else has gotten some.
Even with that, you know, that's one thing in, you know, a country that doesn't have the option to end humanity with the press of a button. But putting someone that unstable, that erratic, you know, who will get in Twitter wars at 3 a.m., well, now he can get in actual wars at 3 a.m.
It's almost like the exact same thing that happened in Britain 6 months ago when they listened to everything Nigel Farage said, even though he is clearly unhinged, and just made shit up the whole time. And then they're like, you know what? He's right. The system's fucked against me. I'm going to flip the table even though it makes no rational sense. People don't vote rationally. I'm not against democracy, but this makes me very cynical about it.
Yeah, it's hard to come away from this election with any sort of view that democracy is working great. Turnout was low. The result didn't reflect the popular vote. It was just altogether not a great election.
Well, and the entire commentary up until the point was this weird circus of let's give Trump a bunch of media attention without any critical analysis, or when there was, it just managed to get washed away. And meanwhile, let's talk a whole bunch about Hillary Clinton's emails, even when there was, in the end, no criminal investigation.
That was the thing that really stuck out when I was looking at kind of the state-by-state breakdown, especially in the Rust Belt, is how much of this was low Democratic turnout. Turnout across the board was down, but if you actually look at Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, the Republican numbers are basically constant in terms of votes. Plus or minus a few thousand here or there, but essentially unchanged from 4 years ago, and the Democrat numbers are down a lot. These weren't new voters that Trump brought out. This was...
Well, they might be.
Well, okay.
But then they scared away other voters.
Yeah. The net effect was basically no change in the Republicans, and for every new voter they gained, they lost one somewhere else. But the Democratic numbers, they were down, particularly, I think, in Michigan and Ohio, states which went blue last time, and there were big drops in this time.
Yeah, there's lots of blame to go around. I want to focus like 99% of it on Trump, a fraction of it on a big fraction on all the people who voted for him, obviously. But this is the Democratic Party that had the strongest machine, probably the most money, and just the clearest drive and purpose to win. But they do stupid shit like hold their rally on election night in a room with a literal glass ceiling, thinking, oh, it'll be Hillary Clinton symbolically breaking it. Only now it's just a literal glass ceiling that she can't break through. This is the campaign that I predicted and I'd hoped that they had the knowledge and wherewithal to have a bunch of Oppo research to dump in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. Instead, they coasted, being like, we'll just eke this out, and that's how we're going to win this.
Well, that's the thing. I think a lot of people got lured into a false sense of security because of just how terrible Donald Trump is. I'm still, even a couple days later, haven't quite wrapped my head around that he managed to get basically half of American voters to vote for him. On paper, this is a person you would expect to get 5%, maybe. The lizard
fringe party.
Yeah, the lizard quotient. Like in any poll, 5% of people will answer some question completely nuts. That's basically who I expect to be voting for Donald Trump in this one, not half of America.
So the Democrats screwed the campaign in the way I think Canadians and especially NDP voters know all too well, which is we're just going to coast to victory by not screwing up. And that's not worked in BC. That's not worked federally. That's not worked in Ontario. What worked in Alberta was having a progressive platform with a popular leader and a crumbling opposition or other party. So I have to assume they had the best people, but they clearly didn't.
It almost makes it sound like Trump was right when he says he'll have the best people.
He had friggin' Breitbart people on his team. He was the alt-right.
Yeah, this is a team, his campaign team, they weren't even the B team. They were the T team, the U team. Like, they were the
KKK team. Let's be freaking frank here.
Yeah, these are not brilliant political minds who took a dark horse candidate to the end. This was failures across the board. And we were talking about opposition research. Where the hell was the Republicans' opposition research during the primary? How did that tape not come out and not be discovered by Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, any of them?
So the Republican establishment failed. The Democratic Party as a whole failed. The Electoral College failed. White people failed. Trump's the only one who won, which is scary. I'm terrified. Let's pivot and come back to Canada, where we actually live and have things to say about. Trump's big thing he talked about was tearing up NAFTA. NAFTA is a huge deal for BC because we export so many resources, so many natural resources to the States, that new tariffs on that would cripple the BC economy probably overnight.
Yes, and it's definitely a major concern. I think BC is probably a little less exposed. We don't know what a post-NAFTA tariff situation is going to look like, but it's generally manufactured goods and agricultural products that typically have the highest tariffs, so we're actually not too bad on that. Because for us, it's mostly lumber, petroleum, zinc, of all things, and electricity. Those are the top 5 exports from BC to the U.S.
But it's the uncertainty that's the issue.
Yeah.
It puts this big, giant question mark on everything, economic-wise, at least in Canada.
it may not hurt our exporters so much, but absolutely hurt Canadian consumers who would now have higher prices on anything they buy from the States. It would really hurt the already struggling Ontario manufacturing sector.
And I think beyond that, there's also the sort of spillover effect on our political climate, which we'll get into in a minute when we get into some of the possible Trumps of Canada. But yeah, that trade deal is the biggest thing. We probably won't see TPP, which will make a lot of people happy.
It's almost certainly dead. The TPP has a provision that in order to come into effect, 6 countries representing 85% of the trade area by GDP have to ratify. Now that basically gives the US and Japan vetoes on it because they're both over 15% of the TPP by GDP. And with a Trump who's very outspoken against all trade deals, basically, it's dead in the water. I did see today that Obama was wanting to push through ratification during the lame duck session, but I'm admittedly somewhat skeptical on how likely that is.
If he can't get a Supreme Court nominee through in the last 8 months, getting a giant trade deal through, I'm pretty skeptical of. Particularly when Clinton was already starting to swing against it pretty hard.
That's pretty typical American politics. Everyone campaigns against trade during the election, and I mean, remember when Obama wanted to renegotiate NAFTA and that went nowhere? I think the difference is here, Trump seems more serious, and this is one of his few consistent positions all the way through.
Well, and it's arguably the thing that made a lot of people in that Rust Belt pay attention at first. I mean, I totally stand by the flipping the table, fuck you to people who aren't white and aren't the stereotype privileged American. But that idea that, NAFTA took my jobs away, even though those jobs will never come back no matter what Trump does, so people are just angry.
Yeah, and if you actually dig into the data, it's a lot less clear that NAFTA had a big effect. U.S. manufacturing has doubled in output since the 70s. They're producing more than ever before, but with fewer workers.
It's robots that are taking your job. It's always been robots.
So NAFTA's definitely the big thing. Came up big in last night's conservative debate, which we'll talk about in a bit, and it's, I think, going to be the signature U.S.-Canada relationship issue that's going to define Trudeau's first term. And we're already seeing some, at least in my opinion, concerning signs on it. The U.S. ambassador today said he'd be open to discussing NAFTA and renegotiating elements of it. And I'm just not sure that's the best way. Like, this is an absolutely critical area for Canada's economic future. It would be devastating if we lose it, and this needs to be Trudeau's top priority, is to maintain access to the American market. And sending these kind of, we're open to renegotiating, it's rather questionable as a strategy. I really think we need to be set in a hard line of, this is not an area we're willing to give on, is access to the American market.
Well, you don't understand Trudeau's strategy. Trudeau will put it to a mass nationwide consultation and then literally nothing will happen. So that's how he'll stop any renegotiations, just by letting the people.
Yeah, well, the problem is that's going to do nothing to stop Trump from giving his the 6-month notice that NAFTA requires. If Trudeau's second call wasn't to the Mexican Prime Minister on how we're going to address this, I think he really needs to rethink his foreign policy.
Well, speaking of foreign policy, the other thing that's terrifying is the idea of he who shall not be named with the nuclear codes. And we already know, he says he doesn't know Putin, but he clearly obviously knows Putin, because Putin and WikiLeaks fucking put him in the White House, among other things. Speaking of blame to go around. So Trump has terrible foreign policy. He at least, I think, knows where Aleppo is. But beyond that...
But that only means he'll know where to bomb it.
Yeah. So, bad to be in the Middle East. And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is definitely concerning. In fact, the people who should be really terrified of this isn't us. It's Latvia. It's Estonia. The little tiny million-some-odd people states that border Russia and are NATO members. Trump has talked about how he doesn't think NATO's pulling its weight. Maybe he'll come to NATO's aid, maybe he won't. And it's that sort of ambiguity that's really dangerous. Those hard lines that people actually think you're serious on, they usually won't push you on those. It's when they think you're not as serious as you actually are that they'll push and a war will start.
So when Russia marches into Crimea and Trump goes, oh, that didn't really happen. Crimeans just wanted to be Russian again. And we'll probably see that again with free countries have Soviet troops on the ground.
We actually have troops in the Baltic region, and if that ambiguity is still going on, Putin makes a move, we could have Canadians in the firing line as a result. And that is seriously dangerous, and it would be an absolute disaster if Article 5 gets invoked and half the countries respond and the US sits out or something else. European security's definitely been weakened, and Canadian security's been weakened as well. We've massively underfunded our military over decades as a multi-party effort, and our ships are rusting out. We needed new planes 10 years ago. We needed new helicopters 30 years ago, and we basically don't have the resources to adequately defend the amount of territory we have right now. And we've kind of been complacent on it because we're part of NATO, and that Article 5 has been our safety net, but we're spending 1% on GDP, 1% of GDP on defense. The North Atlantic Treaty calls for 2%, and that's a point Trump's raised quite a bit, and I hate to admit it, but I actually agree with him on this, that we're really not pulling our weight.
So that's all terrifying. Tomorrow, and I guess it'll be today when I get this up, probably Friday morning, will be Remembrance Day. And one of the cores in the Remembrance Day, the way I approach Remembrance Day, is to not have to keep having Remembrance Days other than to remember all the people who've died in the past. We don't want to keep killing soldiers. We don't want more wars. This is not the path to fewer wars. This is the path to more wars and more soldiers in harm's way. And that's terrifying and tragic and fuck.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, I mean, Clinton's got a reputation as a bit of a hawk, but I don't think anyone seriously doubted that she would ever really weigh the consequences of any intervention and wouldn't consider that there was quite a likely chance that many people wouldn't be coming home from any of those actions. And I'm not sure Trump sees it the same way. He definitely tends to perceive others as more disposable.
The only way he might, and it's an even more terrifying thought, not expend American lives is to just nuke things, which is an even more terrifying thought, and maybe he'll just start dropping bombs in the Middle East because that's his solution to terrorism, and that's not going to make anyone friends.
That's the thing, is he's reportedly asked, why do we have nukes if we don't use them? Which is terrifying for anybody to say, let alone somebody who will actually have the nuclear codes.
I feel like that's the subject of like a grade 8 social studies project where you go, this is why we have, nuclear deterrence. And that's what they're trying to get at. But he can't get that level because he's not there yet. Yeah. And now he's fucking president.
If you asked him what MAD stands for, he'd probably just think it's an emotion.
Or the magazine.
That too. Actually, that'd probably be his first response. He also asked what the nuclear triad was. So he has shown absolutely no knowledge of U.S. nuclear policy, nuclear strategy, any of that sort of stuff. He's advocated that South Korea, Japan, and even Saudi Arabia start arming themselves so that the U.S. doesn't have to keep spending money to defend them. In addition to making, war in Eastern Europe more likely, we've also just upped the chance that nuclear war is more likely. I'm saying we here, but Americans. Let's be clear. The Americans who fucking voted for that guy made that more likely.
And there's the hope that he'll be a sort of puppet president, or he'll get impeached, or he'll not last, or he'll quit, or whatever, and he'll just not be in charge. But what then terrifies me in a different way is the idea of a Mike Pence presidency, because he is just like traditional Republican evil. He is the anti-gay bigot who wants to push conversion therapy on people. He's in favor of all the other terrible Republican policies. That will mean more people dying in the streets.
Yeah, but I'd much rather Mike Pence presidency than a Donald Trump presidency. Mike Pence is just conventionally bad. He'd put in a bunch of bad policies. You know, he might launch a few more interventions in, you know, countries that aren't likely to pose an existential threat to NATO members, anything like that. He'd just be conventionally bad. You know, America came through the Bush years mostly okay. There were definitely some parts that weren't doing as well as they were in 2000, but, you know, it was largely okay afterwards, and it doesn't seem as likely that that's going to be the same thing 4 or 8 years from now.
For me, it's just easy to say that kind of, or go down that line of thought when I know that the policies of a Mike Pence probably wouldn't change the world a lot for me, because I'm not going to ever need to get an abortion. I'm not going to be subject to racial profiling. I'm not going to be, you know, shot in the street by cops. I'm not going to be everything else that's going bad. So the U.S. is fucked. Let's just...
Yeah. But I keep circling back to this, but the U.S. has access to some really horrifyingly powerful technologies. And I disagree with Mike Pence on a lot of stuff, but he's just stable bad. He wouldn't use those without a very good reason. And Donald Trump just does not seem to be the same way.
All right, so how do we stop it from happening in Canada? Let's talk about who our Trumps are. And the most obvious first candidate is Kelly Leitch, who is literally last night bragging about having a lot in common with him. And of course Steve Blaney, who's the other sort of Conservative Party candidate leader who's running on the Canadian values platform without really ever defining what those are.
Yeah, they've both kind of danced around exactly what the Canadian values are. Gender equality is one that seems to keep coming up in those, which, does that mean we're not letting Trump in? But yeah, it's a very vague, also in a somewhat Trumpian sense, you know, just hitting the emotional high points without really digging into the details. There's some resonance there, and I mean, I've been wrong on how likely everything Trump has done is, but it doesn't strike me as likely to resonate up here.
I think it's a different angle at the same dog whistle. They're playing to, because they only talk about Canadian values when they talk about immigrants. And so when Kelly Leitch is talking about it, she's talking about people coming to this country. And this is a country that has pushed harder on the multiculturalism, and we welcome immigrants. And you don't have to give up all of what you brought here, but you do have to sort of support democracy and some level of human rights. In terms of where the constituency is here in Canada, we do have the same rural-urban divide that America has, where rural Canada is overwhelmingly conservative voting, especially in the West, and the cities are the bastions of NDP and Liberal seats, and the suburbs are sort of mixed depending on who's playing which policy. So the idea of a Trump-light taking the Conservative Party in a more nationalistic, racist sort of way is not impossible. And there would be a lot of places you can play that. I bet you could even play that pretty strongly in Quebec, where they talked about the secularism charter, where it was just really, let's just make Muslims be French Canadians.
Yes, that's the thing from last election when the niqab came up as a major issue. In English Canada, that was kind of the stumbling point for the Conservative campaign. They were doing reasonably well up until that point. The poll numbers started to tank after that came up. And there was a fairly resounding rejection from at least the English part of Canada that doesn't get as culturally obsessed as Quebec does. But it actually polled fairly well in Quebec and probably helped the Conservatives there. And that also kicked off the NDP's decline in the last election, too. The budget issue and the balanced budgets, that hurt them. But what I think really tipped them over the edge, or at least was a major contributor, was when they, rightly in my opinion, came out on the cab issue as, you know, we're not we don't want to go that route the Conservatives are going. We're going to oppose any ban on it. But that was an unpopular position in Quebec. Their Quebec numbers started to tank. Their seat projections started to tank. And the strategic voter went Liberal because it looked like they were the more viable party.
And that's all fair, and I believe, and I mostly agree with all of that. I just think going forward, with the revolt we saw of sort of rural England on Brexit, and the revolt we've now seen with rural America on Trump, we could see potentially a sort of rural Canada, where's mine, if things sort of stay stagnant, because, well, unfortunately, people keep kicking the economy in the balls, so it's going to stay stagnant. I think the economy has done better in Canada, specifically in BC, than elsewhere in the world, and not amazing, but sort of a little bit above.
Yeah, I don't see that urban-rural divide being quite as strong in Canada, in part just because we're a more urbanized country. Canada's sitting around the 80-85% urban, and the US is in the 70s. So that's going to make it harder to gain electoral foothold that way, although the urban ridings are somewhat underrepresented on a per capita level. And if you'd asked me this a year ago, I would have been a lot more confident that it really couldn't gain a foothold.
Because literally anything can happen now.
Yes. And it definitely shaken up some of their conceptions. I'm not sure this is necessarily a long-term winning strategy. The demographics aren't in favor of that, and I'm not sure this is any grand strategic plan on the part of the Conservatives.
I don't think, to be fair, just on that one point, that Trump had a grand strategic plan.
Yes, this strikes me really as a reacting to things. Kelly Leitch, in the last campaign, was the person who announced the Barbaric Cultural Practices Hotline. And she looked pretty uncomfortable on that stage doing it. You could tell her heart really wasn't in it at the time. And she kind of got stuck with that label, and I think she's been trying to play off it ever since, and she's got stuck with the brand, and she's using that brand to the best of her abilities. But even if it resonates with the conservative voters who are going to be selecting the next party leader, I'm not necessarily sure that can translate into seats in the coming election, especially outside of Quebec.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we do have a bit more going for us in Canada, even though it's a very small media, our media has been very critical of Kelly Leitch over that issue, and the backlash has been stronger. Of course, there's clearly a segment of the US that hates the establishment media and didn't listen to any of it, and they've found their own sort of alt-right little fringe groups to listen to, and Facebook allows you to share that and develop that little bubble, and we obviously have our own little bubble as well. And what we have here in Canada is Rebel Media, of course.
Yeah, and you've definitely seen that with the Kelly Leitch campaign, is that they've really gone after the quote-unquote elites. Now, this is somebody who's a surgeon, former professor at U of T, a cabinet minister, one of the senior 30 most people in the country, and has a list of post-nominals longer than most people's names. So it's a little hard to convincingly see her as anything but an elite, even though she's trying to ride that bandwagon.
But Trump is a fucking billionaire businessman, and his argument was just, of course I know the elites are screwing you, because I've been screwing you for all my life. As though that's going to make him want to stop.
Yes, and I think elite in general is just not a great term, because you really need a modifier on it. Because, yeah, Donald Trump may have been in the economic elite, but in terms of the cultural elite, that's a lot more debatable. His mannerisms were anything but kind of upper class and respectable. So, yes, in one sense he was an elite, but at the other sense, there's a definite anti-elite mentality to him as well, and persona that latches onto. And to the extent that I've seen Kelly Leitch, she hasn't been able to portray that because I just don't think that's a genuine part of her as effectively.
Well, I want to just touch on two more questions about the US election before we switch gears. The first question is looking more at the provincial level. and specifically Alberta and BC, because I think they're the two most interesting. And then we're going to look just at one specific ballot initiative that I think is very relevant here. At the Alberta level in this last week, we saw Sandra Jansen and Donna Kennedy-Glans drop out of the Alberta Progressive Conservative leadership race. These were the only two women in the race to replace Jim Prentice after their party lost the last election. And Sandra Jansen came out saying there was a lot of sexist harassment and bullying targeted at her for being a woman daring to run the Progressive Conservative Party in Alberta. And it all sort of culminated at the last convention where she felt there was a very targeted campaign at her. And she sort of pointed the finger without naming him at Jason Kenney. And the fact Donna Kennedy-Glans dropped out at the same time without saying as much was strongly interpreted as being they're both basically fingering him and his supporters more specifically as running this vicious attack on them. And it's not that anyone has said Jason Kenney is in any way a misogynist, a Donald Trump racist, or pushing these forward. He's sort of letting it happen and cultivating this kind of angry right-wing crowd in his hope of merging the Progressive Conservatives and Wild Rose in Alberta.
Yeah, so this is a somewhat concerning trend line because 2 leaders ago, it was Alison Redford who'd won the campaign, and if the party was welcoming then and isn't now, that's not a good sign.
Well, and Alison Redford got her share of abuse that she talked about both, I think, while leader and after. And Danielle Smith was leader of the Wild Rose and really brought it from the wilderness into the limelight in Alberta. And she got some abuse as well, as all female politicians do these days because human beings are terrible, as we're continuing to learn. But both of those sort of pale in comparison to the vitriol and hate that's been directed at Rachel Notley. And what worries me most about my home province is conditions aren't as good there as they are here in BC. They're frankly really rough for a lot of people because of the dropping oil prices has cost a lot of oil sands jobs, and so a lot of people are still out of work. I haven't been back in a few months, so I don't know how it feels right now, but the last time I was there, there's this the sky is falling type sense when you just sort of walk around and talk to people. And it's that kind of situation where even if the numbers show it's reasonable or it's not that bad, that non-rational sense drives this sort of, we need someone who can change the system or flip the table, and that scares me.
Yes, it's something we're definitely going to have to keep an eye on going forward.
The other province I would look at is here in British Columbia, where I'm a little bit more optimistic right now. There's a lot of hate on for Christy Clark, but she is no Donald Trump, and anyone who puts her in the same realm is looking through partisan blinders.
She's too bland to be Donald Trump.
Well, number one, she's a woman. So she's a woman who has admitted to having sexual violence committed against her. And that was a brave and powerful thing she did. And she didn't do it, as far as anyone could tell, for political points. She did it because she needed to speak out to highlight the fact this happens to too many women. And even with her general policies, she is the head of the BC Liberals, who are the sort of right-wing party in BC, but they're the sort of center-right. On social issues, they have started to take progressive steps, especially in the last year. They brought in the change to the BC Human Rights Act to make gender expression and gender identity a protected ground. They've pushed down to all schools in BC, both public and private, that they need to respect LGBTQ rights. These are long overdue, but these aren't something you would see from the sort of regressive populist candidate. So I think we have a good situation right now. There's lots I'm going to criticize Christy Clark about, but I will take her over Mike Pence or Donald Trump any day of the week. I guess the other question to me, though, is what happens after Christy Clark. If she loses the election in May, the BC Liberals will probably kick her out and go on a hunt for a new leader. Will they go angry populist, or will they go a sort of second in line? It's hard to say.
Yeah, at this point it definitely is. It's hard to say. There isn't an obvious successor waiting in the wings, so we're just going to have to see how that plays out. But the one thing in BC that does kind of concern me on the could Trumpism take hold here has to do with real estate. And to the extent that any of those sort of sentiments have been expressed, I most commonly encounter it around the real estate market, the overinflated house prices, the concerns over foreign buyers. A lot of it seems to be directed at the Chinese, who are the obvious scapegoats in this one. And if anything I think could balloon out of control, it would be resentment fueled by the real estate sector.
And BC's got this terrible anti-Chinese history that we don't acknowledge much, if at all, generally, of head taxes at the federal level, I guess, and just racist policies all the way down to, at some municipal levels, there's still policies on the books that are not enforceable, that in the disclosures when you buy property say this is a whites neighborhood, essentially. That's how racist the history of BC is. And that's just sort of bubbles under the surface. It doesn't just go away, and we can't just pretend we're race blind now, because that's always going to be there. So this is something I also sort of see, especially it percolates here in the city of Vancouver, in Metro Van, but it's something I can see bubbling a lot more, where people don't even know someone who is of Asian descent, like in the interior, where they can just sort of generate ideas about how all these things work and just go off into conspiratorial lands about mass waves of immigration will suddenly mean dog meat will be sold in the market around the corner. I have heard these stories from people. That's how racist this province still is. So, yeah, I'm scared. But in the meantime, I'm going to bet that as soon as Trump Tower opens here in Vancouver, someone's going to egg that sign daily for every day of his presidency, and it'll be vandalized probably once a month.
Yeah, well, even as soon as basically the election was stalled, we were already hearing jokes about going down to vandalize the place.
And we do not condone vandalism. Civil disobedience, I'm all up for.
Okay, one final note on the election down south. Washington State had a carbon tax on its ballot, modeled after the BC one. Initiative I-732 got defeated. We're really just bringing this up to kind of highlight how the BC model is being used elsewhere and has been advocated for by a lot of other jurisdictions. Hasn't always been advanced, but this one here, the Michael Chon plan for carbon taxes, are all explicitly modeled after BC.
Well, and it really divided the environmental movement in Washington, I remember hearing about, because it's we're going to bring in a carbon tax, but then we're also going to make sure it's revenue neutral. But there are a lot of environmentalists who are also very left-wing who say, if we're going to bring in a carbon tax, we should use that money to fund more progressive programs, to help the lower income classes, and to really fund green infrastructure, for example. But this one was just sort of, we're going to bring in the tax and have income tax cuts, as far as I could tell. And it might be favored towards the low income, but it was that sort of question mark.
Yes, and this one's actually really, the background on this is really interesting. We won't get into too much, but basically, this was spearheaded by one person who got a couple of people together and built an organization for this kind of by himself, without really interacting with all the environmental groups, all the social justice, basically the whole left-wing activist infrastructure that exists in Washington. And there was a lot of apparently background fighting between the two groups on it. So you saw a lot of various self-labeled progressive groups opposing a climate change plan. And I think this really illustrates the whole perfect is the enemy of good. It's better to have some climate action going than nothing, in the hopes of, having more community consultation, bringing more people together, and maybe having something a couple of years down the road. And especially on the revenue neutral side, if you want to not make it just a purely partisan issue and get people, in the center or center right, you have to have the revenue neutral thing in there, because otherwise they're just going to see big tax grab and it's going to scare them away. And that's also been part of the success of the BC model, is the tax cuts that came with it have made it pretty politically popular. Where if you're going to get rid of it, now you have to raise a whole bunch of other taxes.
The only other thing I'll say on it is it also shows the danger of and the difficulty of putting complex policies to referendum where all those personal biases and personal politics come up.
And that has been Politicoast. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticoastPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.